Pretoria in 1982, it was one seminary that had philosophy and theology. So you will finish your philosophy, then move on into your theology. We had to apply for that permission to study and live with white students, but we could not be found in the same transport system. We could not be in the same bus, or could not be in the same car with white people at that time. In 1983, Father Nolan came to address us. It was strange because at that time we knew him as a radical prophetic voice in South Africa. But then he came to address us in the seminary and he challenged us to go and join the Young Christian Workers Movement. And we were scared because at that time you would be arrested. But he said, go and try it. He said to us, you cannot teach about justice unless if you know something about justice. You cannot talk to the young workers until you know what they go through on a daily basis in their work environment. One of us asked him, said, hey, Father, what if we get arrested? He said, what did Mandela say in 1963 when he stood before the judge, before he was sent to Robben Island for 27 years for his involvement in his fight against apartheid? He said, Mandela said, a democratic and a free society is an ideal for which I live for. But my Lord, if it needs be, it's an ideal for which I am prepared to die. Then Father Nolan said to us, what are you willing to die for? Then in 1983, in June, I spent 5 weeks training and being part of the Young Workers Movement. But Father Nolan emphasized, he said, when you go to the workers, you must wear your T-shirt. It was a nice T-shirt written Young Christian Workers. Every time we met the police, we'll cover our shirts, and then they will pass. So it was an experience, and we only got to have that experience because Father Nolan encouraged us to be part of that, and he said to us, if it needs be, being arrested is the price you have to pay in order for you to understand the struggle of the young workers. And in that time, I learned 3 things. When we were doing that course and going into the work environment, they taught us, whenever you see the workers struggling, you must see, judge, and act. That stayed with me. I was only arrested once for being a member of the Young Christian Workers. But when I was handcuffed, I said, but Father Nolan, you are enjoying your time in Cape Town. I'm under arrest. But his words came back to me. What are you willing to die for?
Excuse me. Thank you so much, Father Thulani. We'll come back another round to some of the other questions if we have enough time. I'd like to turn now to Professor Fanny Rushing, who for many years was Director of Minority Student Services, a faculty member here, here at Dominican University, and Midwest Regional Director of the American Friends Service Committee program on South Africa. You co-founded the Chicago Coalition on South Africa, an organization in support of the liberation of Southern Africa, Angola, Mozambique, Namibia, and South Africa. For the past 20 years, Dr. Rushing has been co-chair of the Chicago Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, intergenerational archival and oral history project that preserves the history of the civil rights movement nationally and in Chicago. And she is currently professor of history at Benedictine University. Dr. Rushing, I wonder if you could tell us a bit about the origins of the anti-apartheid movement here in the U.S., and how did that emerge for you? Why did you get involved?
Okay, thank you. First of all, I want to apologize for being late. It's just a whole series of horrible things that came together. But I also want to thank all of you very much for coming and allowing me once again to be in this beautiful chapel at Dominican University. There are so many wonderful memories that I have of this place and of the active involvement of so many wonderful sisters who lived such a life of engagement that it is just so rewarding to be back. And I also want to thank you for inviting me into the life of Father Nolan, who I did not know. But I have to say, and this is a bit off the chart, I was so struck by the words that you offered of Father Nolan that encouraged you in the path that you were walking. And I'm very taken by this concept of time that he spoke about in the book, because we're living in a moment where we are being called to witness. And if anything is important about the anti-apartheid movement, it teaches us what people can do to bring about change once they commit to that. My fear is that we're living in a moment where we're normalizing war and genocide. And we have to, as Camilo Torres said, if you are a Christian, you have to be a revolutionary because Christ was a revolutionary. And we need to recall those voices that engage us, that encourage us to continue the fight for justice. I simply could not help introducing that because of the terror that I'm seeing every night, the destruction of human life in Gaza. And when are we going to, as a people, respond to this? Because it was a worldwide effort to destroy the apartheid regime in South Africa. It is one of the greatest moments in our history when people from around the world came together to declare South Africa a rogue and renegade state that was denying the life and existence of the vast majority of the people. We are watching that again. We need to revive the anti-apartheid movement in order to crush what is going on in Gaza and to bring about peace. What is happening in Gaza is a threat to the region, it is a threat to humanity, and it is a threat to the ongoing existence of our planet. We need a worldwide movement to condemn this and to demand that war is not an alternative, that there must be peaceful solutions found to this. So I'm sorry for going off script. The anti-apartheid movement in the United States in particular, and something that I was a part of from the time I was about 15. And that was because in Chicago, which has always had this very long history of radical involvement and commitment, I was fortunate enough to be in a city where there were many people who had been a part of the labor movement, part of the civil rights movement, and taught us about conditions in South Africa. When I went to, as a 19-year-old, to work for the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, a major civil rights organization, that is when I really became aware of what was going on in South Africa. And it became an ongoing part of our work, particularly as the civil rights movement became the Black Power and the Black Liberation movement, so that we began to identify with liberation movements around the world. And in Chicago, Dennis Brutus, South African poet, exile, revolutionary, was living here because he was teaching at Northwestern. And we used to have regular sessions where he would invite people also in exile to come and talk with us. And there is nothing more important in struggle than knowing the people that you're struggling with. I can remember an event here at Dominican where we had visitors from South Africa, and some disgruntled soul said to one of the sisters, I hear that there are terrorists in the building. And the sister said, oh no, that can't be true. I just had dinner with those young men, and they aren't terrorists, they are simply fighting for their homeland. It makes a difference when you know people. It makes a difference when there is a face on struggle, that it's not just numbers, that it's not just an abstraction, but that you actually can understand what it is that people are suffering through knowing them. And the fact that we get cut off from people is one of the things that allows us to harden ourselves to what we see because we don't know them.
Thank you so much, Professor Rushing, for making the links between then and now. We really appreciate that. Father Timothy Radcliffe, many of you probably watched his 6 beautiful, brilliant talks to the Synod participants in the retreat that he gave before the Synod began in early October. He is former master of the Dominican Order of Preachers. How is it you didn't decline?
I'll tell you afterwards, Barbara. Over a good drink.
Good. Deal. So many of you have read Father Timothy's inspiring books. His most recent one is co-authored with Łukasz Popko, who's also a Dominican friar. It's 18 conversations between God and humanity in the Bible, and it's a real gem if you haven't read it yet. So, Timothy, what are some of the important memories of your time with Albert? And he's not the only Dominican who's been who's notable for this kind of work for justice. Can you comment on that, and what more can you share with us about how his work can help us today in our fights against racism?
Perhaps I could start with the memories, which was
Please.
the first thing. I got to know him the same time as you did, actually, Father Trelawney, 1983, and he was coming to visit my priory in Oxford. And we were extremely excited because he'd just been asked to be excused from being Master of the Order. He was in all the newspapers, he was terribly famous, and we were so proud that he was coming to stay with us. At the same time, I have to admit that we were very nervous, because we knew he'd taken a radical option for the poor, and he was going to stay with us in the middle of Oxford University, this splendid, expensive place. And I had to be honest, we feared that he might look down on us, being mediocre. And so I took him to the pub. And of course, you know that the Dominican Order is supposed to be founded in a pub. So whenever in doubt, go to the pub. And two things struck me really. First of all, he immediately made contact with everybody in that pub. And before long, we were singing. Now, in those days, English pubs, last orders were called at 10:30, and you were locked out at 11, unless you were locked in. And so Albert and I stayed till about 2 in the morning as he entertained everybody, and they loved him with a joy. And I learned two very important things. That the true prophet meets you where you are. He accepted us as we were, where we are, without condemnation. And secondly, his joy. And I met Albert innumerable times, but always it was with that joy. The second time was when he was provincial, about 1988, and he'd never organized a provincial chapter in his life. And I was provincial, so he asked me to come along to help them organize one. I didn't tell him that I never organized one either. So I didn't want to miss the opportunity to go to South Africa and to spend time with Albert. And he picked me up from the airport, and on the way, we were driving along, not terribly fast, and this kid ran out in front of the car and was hit and landed on the windscreen, badly injured. And Albert immediately wanted us to take him to the hospital. And what bowled me over was his infinite concern for this little kid, covered with blood. We were all covered with blood at this stage. And on the way back, we went to see him, and Albert worked then with his family, and I was bowled over by that individual concern. Here was a little human being with the same dignity as anybody else. And I just have a third tiny memory. We kept up right to the end, really. About every 6 months, we'd email each other. And in the end, of course, all he could do, but his great joy, was he prepared the homily every day for the sisters. And I know what a joy that was for him, but it was a joy for them, but it was a joy for him. That in the end, he was a preacher, right to the last moment, preaching in again how he bore his illness. What else did you want me to talk about, Barbara, now? Or do you want to go back to the beginning again?
Those are great memories, Timothy. I just was wondering if you could help us reflect a little bit about Albert is not unique in being this kind of a prophetic voice for justice in the order. Can you tie in what he was doing with some of the rest of our history of similar kinds of prophetic communities and individuals?
One of the things that struck me about Albert is he talked about what he saw and he knew, which really reminds me of the beginning of the first letter of St. John, the word of life, what we have heard, what we have seen, what we have touched. And because this was absolutely central to the testimony of Bartolomé de las Casas. He witnessed to the suffering he'd seen. He'd first seen slaves being landed in Spain when he was a child, and it touched him. And all of his great history of the Indies was a witness to what he'd experienced. And I think that Albert was in that tradition of immersion in what is touched and known and seen and heard, the whole basis of contextual theology. But because it didn't just stop there. For Bartolomé de las Casas, part of his struggle for justice was also writing and thinking. and he astonished people. Wherever he went, he was accompanied by this great crowd of indigenous people who carried his books, his big, heavy, fat volumes, because they knew that their liberation, the fight for their liberation, went with this study. And that, of course, reflected the other aspect of Albert's life, which we'll hear more about later, perhaps from Don, is that he was a writer and a thinker, and that all that experience had to be transmuted into the gold of theology. And I think characteristic of our tradition is the profound link between experience and reflection. They both need each other. It's what we in the order call the Salamanca process. The contact originally between Bartolomé Las Casas and Francisco de Victoria in Salamanca. The professors and the people on the ground working together. And Albert bore both of those in his own life.
Thank you so much. Don, we'd like to hear from you about his writings, especially Jesus Before Christianity. So Father Don Gergen is a Dominican priest, theologian, teacher, and author himself. He has published many articles, 10 books, and has given retreats in Asia, Africa, and throughout North America, as well as having been provincial for the Dominican Central Province, and just recently finished being second in line to the provincial, yes?
Yes, indeed. Toughest task.
Your face is telling us how happy you are to now be going on retreats yourself in a freer time. But Don, could you tell us about your experiences of Albert and especially his impact on systematic theology? And if you could say
Let me
just a bit,
first
too,
say
about
that I've
Jesus.
been touched by what the other panelists have said, because it takes me back 50 years, remembering when apartheid fell and collapsed, and in a less bloody way than I would have expected. And at that time, I didn't expect it would even collapse in my lifetime, because, so it's kind of touching to just be here and reflect on that experience. I don't know when I first met Albert, but I do know that I spent 3 weeks with him in South Africa in 1995 after being provincial and was on sabbatical. But I wouldn't have gone there if I hadn't met him before that. And then he spent a couple months with us at a Dominican contemplative house we had in Wisconsin known as the Dominican Ashram. At one point he came. But words that come to mind, and people have already used many that are descriptive, but I would say a man of integrity. In other words, he was who he was, and you knew what he stood for. Not only integrity, but tremendous humility, in the sense he never thought of himself or presented himself in any kind of egoic way, as if he were prophetic or something of that sort, and always open to learning, is my experience, because although he published the book in 76, and it was very well known at the time, I think it sold over 150,000 copies, but I can remember Albert saying to me how Harvey Cox, who taught at Harvard at the time, and his famous book, The Secular City, was well known, but how Harvey Cox said he used it always as a text with his undergraduates. And Albert was pleased at how that. And so 30 years later, he published a book called Jesus Today. And so Jesus was always on his mind, let us say. But he was always open to learning more, because when he came and spent time with us at the ashram, he was very interested in developing and approaching the whole contemplative dimension of our life. Someone whom you think of as being an extremely active person. But also in that same kind of sabbatical time, he went and spent time at what was known as Genesis Farm, sponsored by the Caldwell Dominican Sisters, several months there, which he was learning then about, like care for the earth, things of this sort. And so he continually was open to learning. And I think that was part of the thing I maybe would most mention about him, that I'd want to be sure gets said, if the expression's been used a couple times, like, it's not only his books on Jesus, but his books on Jesus certainly exemplify it, but contextual theology is what I'd want to emphasize. You made reference earlier, Barb, to the Institute of Contextual Theology, but I just looked back in the last couple of days through my folder that I had, and he has an article in 1984 on spiritual growth and the option for the poor. And then you mentioned, so I won't say more, but he had an article about the whole Kairos document, and about 150 people had signed that, which was, again, he had to go into hiding, and I think that's when he wrote another book called God in South Africa, which was a very contextual approach. But other articles that he had, a very significant one was an address he had given in Toronto, Contextual Theology, One Faith, Many Theologies, an article, The People as a Theological Concept, showing that, again, where you begin. A theology of liberation, a new method of doing theology. So I think, in his own way, he was a beautiful blend of the scholarly and the experiential, which is what contextual theology is all about. I mention it because recently, you may be more than aware of it, but Pope Francis issued recently a motu proprio for professors of theology, especially for the Theology Institute associated with Rome. And he talked about promoting theology in the future cannot be limited to abstractly reproposing formulas and schemes of the past. And then, in paragraph 4, he says, theological reflection is therefore called to a turning point, to a paradigm shift that commits it to fundamentally be contextual theology. In fact, it was a course in contextual theology I was teaching at Aquinas Institute in St. Louis. Scott would have been in the class at the time, and I don't know again how it happened, but Albert was in the country, so I invited him to come and give a lecture in that class on contextual theology. But I think everything that's been said indicates, as a humble man, he was so innovative in a profoundly Christian, contemplative, active way, and that it's changed the course of how we think about theology, which I'm sure you, Sister Barb, would be agreeable to saying is a very important aspect of our lives, and that he was very influential to the point where now Pope Francis is calling for, in the same way, using the same language, that theology, now in a way theology's always been done contextually, whether it was, in a monastery or whether it was in a university or whatever, but calling to mind the importance of starting with the experiential, with the diversity of different cultures, of intergenerational, all of these things being brought into play. So, although Jesus before Christianity is what he's so well known for, and just the title, Jesus before Christianity, meant he wanted to get at who is this Jesus before, in a sense, having been raised from the dead, he was theologized in the church in a beautiful way, but who was that prophetic Jesus who manifested the kind of courage that you've been talking about? So I think that's, I'll stop there, but I did want to emphasize that I think his contribution in terms of his writings goes beyond Christology, although there was Jesus before Christianity, 30 years later, Jesus today. Jesus is obviously on his mind, but his approach, his method, is, I think, the significant aspect of his legacy, of how he was teaching us how we do what we do. And Timothy referred to that in terms of also the Salamanca process, that kind of thing. But anyway, so be it.
Thank you so much, Don. We'd like to hear what's on your mind in terms of questions that you'd like to pose to continue this conversation, and we'll hear more from each of our panelists as we pose questions to them. We'd invite you to take a 1 minute stand up if you would like, and if you have a question that you're ready to formulate. John, are you the one that will collect them? Great. So John will come around and the other employees from Dominican and collect your cards, and we'll continue the conversation. So this question says, since the land that is now Israel belonged to the Palestinians before 1948, isn't any two-state solution that does not give Palestinians full citizenship in Israel simply replicating apartheid and thus destined to fail? Who would like to comment on that?
Well, again, the whole question of South Africa is really a model for how we look at the question of Palestine. For many of us, we came to an understanding about the situation in Palestine because of work in the anti-apartheid movement. And as the anti-apartheid movement, particularly internationally, began to grow, it was very clear what the relationships were between South Africa and Israel. They were both settler colonial states. They were both heavily invested in the usurping of the resources of the region. And so it was illuminating for us to be able to see what has to be done to force the two-state solution that was actually been in discussion since 1948. There is no other way than the two-state solution to not keep having the same kind of horrendous attacks that we've seen since October. The problem is, and again, I was struck by Father Albert's words about convincing ourselves that you can reconcile with evil. I mean, you have to be clear about, you have to study. You can't just struggle. You have to study, and you have to be clear about what the enemy is, because if you are not, you will simply reproduce it. We have to, in the 21st century, in a globally interconnected world, where what you do in one part of the universe destroys not only that space, but other spaces as well, we have got to come to a conclusion that there are moments when humanity must press for justice. And I can't say it enough. One of the things that we learned in the anti-apartheid movement was the ability to make change by putting pressure internationally. There's a tremendous movement going on inside South Africa. There's a tremendous movement going on outside, in the banks, in the schools. Everywhere this has to be attacked. The Palestinian people were promised in 1949 the right to return. They have still not been able to return, and all you have to do is look at a map of Israel in 1949 and look at Israel today. We are watching genocide. And instead of watching it, we have to find those voices that encourage us to stand up and fight.
Perhaps if I could add just a tiny word. When one looks at the situation, I've been in contact with my fellow author Łukasz, who's living in Jerusalem at the moment. it looks hopeless. Every solution seems blocked. And a lot of the violence, I think, springs from despair. And I think one of the things that we have to offer as a faith community is the refusal of despair. And to believe that somehow, however hopeless it actually looks, however impossible any solution seems to be, yet we do have hope. And sometimes, you know, when you're in the middle of a thing, it's almost impossible to have hope for yourself. But at this moment, internationally, as their brothers and sisters, we have to have hope for them in with them, and refuse to accept that this violence, this senseless, meaningless, despairing violence cannot end.
Another question. Did Nolan stay engaged with Desmond Tutu's process of reconciliation? How? What were his thoughts on that?
Can you repeat the question?
Yes, the question was, did Nolan stay engaged with Desmond Tutu's process of reconciliation? How? And what were his thoughts on that?
I believe that he did support the truth and the reconciliation process, because in Mandela's eye, Mandela was like saying there are people who committed crimes. Either they killed on behalf of government, as the police officers, or as whoever, because of what they were taught. But then he believed that the solution, just as we are talking about Israel and Palestine, the solution was a negotiated settlement. So then Mandela said, let's start the truth and the reconciliation process. Every clergy that I know supported that process because it brought about democratic change in South Africa. So I believe he did.
I know he continued to support the process. How he was involved at that point, I don't know, but he certainly continued to be committed to it through the rest of his life.
Thank you. Another question is, this is in quotes, in the struggle between justice and injustice, one can only choose justice, not negotiate injustice. And then the question is, what might Albert say regarding Ukraine and Russia? Calls to negotiate? We can't keep supporting war, yet invasion seems to be unjust.
I'll just comment in a different way, perhaps. It's always difficult in the concrete to know what the best way to oppose injustice might be. That's where we have to think together. How do we do that? And I appreciate what you say about the need, and I was aware at the time of the anti-apartheid movement because I was much younger then. But along with that, I'd want to emphasize that it brings back to me is not only the Israeli-Palestinian, the Ukraine-Russia, but given who we are, who are gathered here, the re-emergence of white supremacy in this country is something that also needs to be very strongly named, because we have a history with it, and apartheid, as you said, was much more so than just the Jim Crow, but this has continued and is re-emerging. It might not always go by that name, but clearly the efforts are there to prevent the black community and others from having the right to vote. Clearly, we are at the brink in our own country of what we see our future as going to be. And so along the lines of what you said, we do need to network in that way to be sure that what we stand for has a voice. Now, I'm conflicted in some ways when we think about justice, injustice, because it's not always totally as clear in the concrete, and that there's also the importance of building bridges among different sides, not when it's clearly evil. And I remember the article Albert wrote on the importance of taking sides. But many years later, I think he did write another little article about taking sides. You know, that, or the first one was the importance of taking sides, but then much later. And so it's just that one has to bring a clarity, as you have tonight, about, you know, the Palestinian situation. But I'd also say a clarity about our country itself and the emergence of white supremacy. And it's not always clear-cut on which side of the divide you might be.
But perhaps I could I really don't know the answer. And I rather dreaded the question. I had a feeling it might come up. But one element of an answer, it's not very much, but a little bit, is if you remember the motto of the order, which is truth, veritas. And a lot of the war, I think, that's going on in Ukraine at the moment reflects mythologies, untruths. It's making me think of 1984 by George Orwell, where you can call anything by whatever name you want. And I think you can see a whole part of the world which is caught up in untruth. Putin, he won't even, until very recently, just the last couple of days, will not refer to it as a war. It was a special military intervention. And I think if you look at the politics today all over the world, we see how there's a detachment from reality. For example, in my country, in England, there's been a rather horrible, detestable policy proposed to export asylum seekers to Rwanda. The Supreme Court of our country declared that this was illegal, against the law, because Rwanda is not safe. What did our government decide? Well, we'll pass a bill declaring it to be safe. Illusion. And so many political problems arise from this detachment from truth, from reality. Whatever the solution will ever be in Ukraine and Russia, I don't know, but it cannot be separate from a seeking of the truth, which of course was such an important part of Albert's Dominican vocation.
There's so much more to be asked and so much more to be said and shared. But before we hear from Hillary Regan, the publisher of the new book, is there anything else that any of our panelists want to say of, oh, I didn't get a chance to share this one, and this is really important, or one last connection you want to help us make with Albert's legacy and the fight against apartheid in South Africa with the challenges that we face today?
One little thing that's probably not so significant as far as taking the time, but when Timothy referred earlier to not giving in to despair and the importance of hope, which is, I think, also along with Veritas, an important aspect of who we are. And this may not resonate accurately because of my memory, but I do remember as a young man, I kind of said earlier, I did not expect apartheid to end in South Africa without a major bloodbath. Now, it was bloody in its own way, but it was. I also did not expect the Soviet Union to collapse in my lifetime without, and it did. I see no solution to the Israeli-Palestinian except that I could say I don't see how it could work out in my lifetime, but in both of those, incredible situations, hope proved true. And that, I think, we need to sustain hope in whatever way we do. Not be optimistic, not be naive, but that what perhaps a prophet does at this time is to not lose hope, and therefore to continue the struggle.
I would say that that's extremely important, that when you lose hope, you can't go on. And I can certainly remember when Soweto happened, I was driving back from the Stand Rock Reservation with Tapson Maweri, who was the Namibian delegate from to the United Nations, and we had been talking about the Southern Africa struggle. And we, were in the middle of nowhere, so there's nothing else to do except talk. And we were philosophizing about how the struggle would come to an end, that Mozambique would fall, Angola would fall, and then finally South Africa. And then we heard the news about what had happened in Soweto. And that changed the dialogue worldwide. I mean, there wasn't anyone anywhere in the world that could justify the shooting and killing of children in the street. And so, similarly, this struggle around Palestine, hundreds of thousands of young people have come out to support the right of the Palestinian people to a free homeland. And so long as there are young people out there who are prepared to fight injustice, yes, there is tremendous hope that in our lifetime we don't have to watch 12 babies outside of an incubator because the lights have been cut off in the hospital. So there is hope. And if we support our young people and encourage them, yes, we may see it in our lifetime. The other thing is that this bombing is destroying the planet. Everybody has a stake in this. It's not just what's happening in Gaza. I mean, we're having earthquakes, we're having volcanic eruptions. The planet cannot sustain this. So, yeah, there is hope. There is hope.
Well, for me, in a way, racism in South Africa prepared me for racism in America. Because if I had not experienced racism in South Africa, I would have not coped here. Let me just cite two quick examples. I came to Mandela in 1985. I had just started my first year of theology in South Africa. Then Cardinal Bernardin gave me a scholarship to study at Mandela. My first 2 weeks, we went to the restaurant, 26 of us. And when it came to me, they stopped me. They said, "Could you see your ID?" I showed them my ID. And they said, some customers may not be happy with a black person here, so they refused me entry. So if I had not experienced that in South Africa, I was going to faint. Then we went to Hampshire in '86 for a rural parish ministry experience. We were going to be hosted by families in Hampshire. And we had dinner. The pastor of the church was about to introduce us when one parishioner raised his hand. There were 28 of us students from Mandela. This guy raised his hand. He said, the seminary did not tell us that one of the students is kind of different. I was like, what do you mean? That one of the students is not the same as others. And I said, do you mean that one of the students is black? Something along those lines, you know. But one old man raised his hand and he said he was going to host me. It turned out he was the mayor of the town. And as his limousine pulled up, then Psalm 23 came to my mind. As I was going into the limousine, he prepares a table for me in the presence of my enemies. It took me time. But anyway, I wanted to say when we got back to South Africa, Reverend Nolan supported us because we experienced racism not just within the government, but in our own church. Just like you have here, there were white parishes, black parishes. All white parishes were ministered by white priests. Black parishes could have a white priest or a black priest, but you would not see a black priest in a white parish. I know this doesn't happen here in America. Does it happen? But anyway, then we started the Association of Black Catholic Priests movement in South Africa. Father Nolan supported us in that because we were challenging the Catholic bishops in South Africa to change the institutional racism. We were challenging the Catholic bishops who were, the majority of them were white. And we were saying, appoint black priests to work in white parishes while the government is showing us how they are doing it as government. The church was not prepared for that change. As a result, because of what we talked about in 1999, now there is a shortage of white priests. Now they are then forced to place black priests in white parishes. Therefore, there is a migration of white church members moving to where white priests are still serving. So what I'm saying is Father Nolan supported us when we were challenging the bishops in South Africa in the 90s to say, you may not do this aware, or you may be aware of it, but there is racism in church, and it must change.
I remember what Albert once said to me. I said to him, Albert, do you fear being assassinated? And he said, I'm too well known now to be assassinated, but you never know, an accident may happen. And he was always aware, right to the end, that an accident could happen, walking on the street, as it were. Last tiny thought. I was very struck by a lot of what you said, Professor Rushing, about how the same battles continue. I saw it at the Synod. We came to the Synod often with our own agenda, each from our own country. This is what we want to achieve. But I think the transformative thing for many of us at the Synod was we suddenly realized that we still live in a colonial world. And often I think our eyes were opened only during the Synod when we heard other people's suffering and realized that we were implicated in it.
Thank you so much, Father Thulani, Father Don, Professor Rushing, Father Timothy. You've given us so much to ponder, not only profound memories of Albert, but reflecting on the tremendous impact of his legacy and how it can help us with the challenges that we face today. Thank you so much. We're so grateful. Before we end, we'd like to hear from Hilary Regan, who's the publisher from ATF Press in Australia, who made the book possible, where you can read more about it.
Thanks, Barbara. I really want to just do a few thank yous, but also to explain the background to how this book came about. Soon after Albert died last year, I suggested to Mike Deeb, a South African Dominican who many of you would know, that we should do something to honour Albert. And I said this should happen sooner rather than later, because these types of books quite often take a while to come out. And so I said, to put a bit of pressure, that we should do this fairly quickly. And so it started really only in December. And by the end of June, we had the book finished. So it was a bit of a marathon. And we had 71 contributors. The book is 504 pages. Timothy wrote the foreword for us, and various other contributors from around the world, including Australia, contributed to it. And so I'd like to acknowledge the work that Mike Deeb and Mark James and Philippe Denis did in putting that together. I'd like to acknowledge all of the contributors to that work as well. We've had various launches of this book around the world. We've had 3 in South Africa, we had some in Australia. There was the possibility of having one in Bethlehem later in the year because there is a Palestinian Kairos document, but now that won't occur. And I should forewarn the speakers here tonight that in Cape Town, Archbishop Brislin, who then became a cardinal the next day, or in the announcement, was that the next day that he would be made a cardinal. So there is a forewarning here that possibly tomorrow some of our panellists may well in fact be appointed. So, another thing to say before I do a few thank yous is that a book like this, like an event like tonight as well, doesn't happen overnight. It's a lot of hard work. And there's about an 8 or a 9 hour time difference between Australia and South Africa. So about this time of the day, I'd be getting WhatsApp messages, I'd be getting phone calls, I'd be getting text messages, there'd be Zoom meetings between myself and the guys in South Africa to work on this book. And that went on for months. So it was a lot of work. As a result of that, I proposed to the Southern African Vice Province that there's a lot of Albert stuff that's out of print. The God in South Africa book that Donald referred to is out of print. There's a whole heap of material in the archives in the Southern African Vice Province that we should be looking at to put together. And so over the next few years, we'll be putting together a number of books, including some of the articles that Donald was referring to. There's a book on biblical spirituality. There's a book on Dominican spirituality. And there's his 2 theses. The thesis when he did his STL, which is on the significance of the Trinity from a Thomistic perspective, and then, very interestingly, his doctorate, which Barbara referred to, which unfortunately has the title of The Lordship of Jesus Christ in the New Testament. And we're looking at publishing that as well, but we will have to tweak the title of that, and we'll have to get someone to contextualise that for us. There's also the sermons that Timothy and Donald were referring to. One other very quick thing to say, in terms of his involvement with the student movement and the worker movement, it's pretty clear to us now that because of that involvement, through one of those people, he was inducted into the ANC. Only after his death did we discover that he had been an operative for the ANC, and he had this code name 42. Unfortunately, the chapter in the book that refers to this is chapter 43, and we should have had it, of course, as chapter 42. That was a bit of a mistake. However, it was because of his involvement with those movements that he did become an operative. So, in terms of thanks, I'd really like to thank Brendan and John and others here, and Nick, who was involved in some of the planning for this, because it is a lot of hard work. I'd like to thank also our panellists. I'd like to, and also Barbara and the other people involved in this. We did have a possibility of a launch in New York, but that didn't occur. And I'd like to acknowledge Rusty, Sister Rusty, who many of you would know, and the others there in New York who were trying to put that together. It didn't happen. But I had the very lovely hospitality of Sister Anne, Sister Margarita, Sister Kathleen, and Sister Rusty there. Finally, just to say how you get the book. We've got the book outside. You can pay cash for it. We've got that book, and we've also got a very other interesting little book of some interviews with Albert, talking about why he didn't become master, and other articles in there, some about the Kairos document, some with the student movement. These books are out there, and you can either pay cash or you can give us your details and we'll invoice you. And for those who are watching from home, this book and the Albert Nolan book, the God and the Reluctant Prophet book, they can be purchased over the next few days while I'm still in the country, and we will send them to you and invoice you. So, I do want to thank various people, and so I would like to thank them formally with a book. So, I'll do this quickly, I promise. Donald. Sorry, I'm going to work out what I'm doing here. Thank you. Timothy already has a copy of the book as a contributor, and so I give him also this other book, but also I promise him. And of course to Barbara. And to John. Is John there? John is here. John is there for the university, a copy of this book. And to Brendan, please, come forward. And to Reg. Reg. And that's enough from me. So thank you all.
Well, in closing, I just have a few more thank yous. Of course, to our panelists. Again, give them just a great hand, and thank you for all that you shared. And also to our wonderful moderator, Barbara Reed, who even came with a broken foot. Thank you. And of course to Hillary and to ATF Press for your recognition of the significance of the story of Albert Nolan. Thank you. And thank you to all those at Dominican University for your help and for your gracious hospitality in providing for this event. We're very grateful. And lastly, thanks to all of you who are here tonight. For some of you, it was an introduction to Albert Nolan, and to others, a reminder of his commitment and his courage to live out the gospel message. Hopefully, for all of us here tonight, this event inspired us to never be silent, in the face of injustice. So please continue the conversations at the reception that's right outside the chapel following this presentation, and I hope it's a wonderful evening for all of you. Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay. One more.
For those who've been watching online, the way to contact me is hdregan, R-E-G-A-N, @atf.org.au. We will then, if you contact me by email, we will send the book out and you'll get an invoice. So thank you.
You did a great job. Do you think we can get a picture with the novice, Timothy and Don, and you, the three of the Dominicans? But probably not. Should you?